The general didn't look away. He didn't even blink. He just leaned over the mahogany desk and whispered 4 words that would end a career. "Just sign it, Sergeant." Sergeant First Class Elias Thorne looked at the document, a sworn statement that would pin the failed extraction in the Kunar Valley on a dead pilot who wasn't there to defend himself. Elias didn't pick up the pen. Instead, he stood at attention, his voice cutting through the stale air of the Pentagon office like a blade. "I will not bear false witness, sir. Not for a promotion, and certainly not for you." 18 years of service, 3 Bronze Stars, and a spotless record were erased in the silence that followed. "You're done, Elias," the general replied, his voice ice cold. "Pack your locker. You're being dishonorably discharged by sunset." But what the general didn't know was that the dead pilot's widow was standing right outside that door. And she wasn't alone. She had brought the one man the general feared most. Elias Thorne wasn't the kind of soldier who looked for the spotlight. At 42, he was the backbone of the 10th Mountain Division's logistics wing, the man who made sure every plate of armor was rated, every Humvee was serviced, and every private knew the name of the man to their left and right. He lived in a small, clapboard house outside Fort Drum, New York, a town where the wind feels like it's made of iron 6 months out of the year, and the local diner still has a welcome home banner from 2004 hanging in the window. Elias didn't run his squad like a unit. He ran it like a sanctuary. He was the guy who remembered which sergeant's kid had the flu and who stayed late in the motor pool to help a rookie fix a transmission so he wouldn't miss his daughter's dance recital. He carried the weight of the unit not because he had to, but because he believed in the sacred contract. We take care of each other. The walls of his small office weren't covered in medals. Instead, they were covered in Polaroids. Snapshots of muddy soldiers laughing over MREs, a photo of his grandfather in Korea, and one framed letter from a mother in Ohio thanking him for making sure her son came home in one piece. For Elias, it was never about the rank. It was about the truth of the mission. The storm began on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the fog sits heavy on the tarmac. Elias was summoned to the tank, the high-security briefing room. Waiting for him was Brigadier General Marcus Vance. Vance was a political soldier. His uniform was too crisp, his smile too rehearsed, and his eyes were always looking for the next star on his shoulder. "Elias," Vance said, sliding a folder across the table. "We're closing the books on the October 12th incident. We need a signature from a senior NCO who was on the comms floor. This statement says Pilot Miller ignored a direct-to-board order, leading to the loss of the transport." Elias opened the folder. His heart skipped. He had been the one on the radio that night. He knew for a fact that Miller had been ordered into that valley by Vance himself, despite the weather warnings. Miller hadn't ignored an order. He had followed one that cost him his life. "This isn't what happened, sir," Elias said, softly. Vance didn't flinch. "It's what the report says happened, Elias. And if this report stays clean, the division keeps its funding. And you, well, I've heard there's a master sergeant slot opening up at the Pentagon. It's yours. All you have to do is agree that Miller was at fault." The room went cold. Elias looked at the pen. It was a simple tool. One signature, and his retirement was secure. One signature, and his family was set for life. Elias took a breath, the kind of breath a man takes before jumping out of a plane into the dark. Pilot Miller had a wife, sir. He had a 4-year-old son who asks why his daddy isn't coming home. If I sign this, that boy grows up thinking his father was a coward who broke the rules. I won't do that to a brother in arms. Vance's jaw clenched. "You're making a mistake, Thorne, a career-ending mistake. Think about your pension. Think about your reputation." "My reputation is the only thing I'm taking with me when I leave this room, sir," Elias replied. He stood up, left the pen untouched, and walked out. He didn't wait for the formal dismissal. He knew the machinery was already turning. By the time he reached the parking lot, his base access had already been flagged. The next 48 hours were a blur of humiliation. They stripped him of his security clearance in front of his squad. They gave him 2 hours to clear out an office he'd occupied for a decade. As Elias walked toward the gate for the last time, carrying a single cardboard box, his soldiers watched in stunned silence. They didn't know the details, but they knew the man. They watched as the MPs escorted him to the perimeter, a hero being treated like a criminal. But as the gate slammed shut behind him, Elias felt a strange sense of peace. He was broke, he was jobless, he was officially dishonored. But as he sat in his truck, he saw a black SUV pull up alongside him. The window rolled down. It was Sarah Miller, the pilot's widow. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "I heard what you did," she whispered, "and I'm not the only one who heard." Sarah Miller didn't just have a story, she had a flash drive. As Elias sat in his truck, the engine ticking as it cooled, she handed it to him. "Elias, my husband knew Vance was dangerous. Before that last flight, he told me that if anything ever happened to him that didn't make sense, I should look for a file named Insurance." Elias plugged the drive into his rugged laptop. It wasn't just a document, it was an audio recording. It was Pilot Miller's cockpit voice recorder from that night, but not the edited version the Army had released. In the raw audio, you could hear the heavy static and Miller's voice, clear and desperate. "Viking Actual, this is Dustoff 6-4. Weather is below minimums. Requesting permission to RTB." And then the response, General Vance's voice, distinct and arrogant. "Negative 6-4, this mission is a go for the cameras. Push through or turn in your wings." Vance hadn't just made a mistake. He had sent a man to die for a photo op, and now he was trying to bury the only NCO who had the backbone to remember the truth. Sarah didn't take Elias to a lawyer's office. She drove him 3 hours south, deep into the Adirondack woods, to a cabin that didn't appear on any GPS. Standing on the porch was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the mountain itself. General Silas the Hammer Graham. Graham was a 4-star legend who had retired 5 years earlier after a fallout with the Joint Chiefs over troop safety. He was the kind of man who didn't care about politics, and he hated perfumed princes like Marcus Vance. "Sergeant Thorne," Graham said, his voice like grinding gravel. "I've been watching what they did to you at Fort Drum. Stripping a man's rank in the motor pool? That's not leadership. That's a firing squad." Elias handed him the flash drive. Graham listened to the audio once, then twice. He didn't explode. He just got quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes a hurricane. "Vance thinks he's playing chess," Graham whispered, "but he forgot that the board is made of the men he stepped on to get to the top." While Elias was in a cabin planning a counterstrike, General Vance was at a black tie gala in D.C. He was clinking glasses with senators, his chest puffed out, showing off the very medals he'd secured by blaming a dead pilot. He had already convinced the board that Elias Thorne was a disgruntled soldier with mental health struggles, a classic character assassination. He thought the fire was out. He thought he had erased the truth. He even had a speech prepared for his 3rd star. But here's the thing about the military. The underground moves faster than the official channels. While Vance was eating lobster, a photo of Elias walking out of the gate with his cardboard box was going viral on private veteran forums. From the barracks at Fort Hood to the outposts in Okinawa, the grunts were talking. They were asking, why did they burn Thorne? The us versus them line had been drawn, and Vance was on the wrong side of it. General Graham didn't call the news. He did something much more surgical. He called an Article 138, a formal complaint against a superior. But he didn't file it through Vance's office. He filed it directly through the Inspector General, bypass-coded with a 4-star override that Vance couldn't touch. The morning the paperwork hit Vance's desk, the general's face went from pale to ghostly white. He realized it wasn't just a sergeant coming for him. It was a ghost from his past. Graham sent a one-line text to Elias that morning. "The objective is in sight. Secure your gear. We're going to court." But Elias knew this wasn't just a legal battle. It was a war for the soul of the army. And he knew that before the truth came out, Vance would try to destroy him, not just professionally, but personally. General Vance didn't wait for the hearing to start his counterattack. 2 days before the official inquiry, a story leaked to a major military news outlet. It claimed that Sergeant First Class Elias Thorne had been under investigation for misappropriation of government property, and that his refusal to sign the Miller report was a desperate attempt to blackmail the command for a plea deal. It was a total fabrication. But in the world of optics, a lie travels halfway around the world before the truth can get its boots on. Elias watched as his old friends, men he'd bled with in the Hindu Kush, unfriended him on social media. His phone went silent. Vance's strategy was simple. If you can't kill the message, kill the messenger. He wanted Elias to feel so isolated, so toxic, that he'd take a quiet settlement and disappear. But Vance forgot one thing. A man who has already lost his career has nothing left to fear but his own conscience. The hearing wasn't in a grand courtroom. It was in a sterile, windowless room in the basement of the Pentagon. 3 colonels sat as the board of inquiry, men who spent more time looking at spreadsheets than scopes. General Vance sat at the front, flanked by JAG lawyers in $3,000 suits. Elias sat at a small wooden table with General Graham behind him. Graham wasn't there as a lawyer, he was there as a silent sentinel. He didn't say a word, but his 4-star rank insignia sat on his shoulders like a pair of loaded cannons. Vance's lawyers started the interrogation. They didn't ask about the Kunar Valley, they asked about Elias's divorce from 10 years ago. They asked about a minor paperwork error he'd made in 2012. They were trying to paint him as a failing soldier with a grudge. For 4 hours, Elias took the hits. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. He remembered what Graham told him. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to stay standing. Then, Vance brought out his axe. A young captain named Reed, the man who had been the co-pilot on the mission. Reed looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Under oath, Reed looked Elias in the eye and lied. He told the board that Pilot Miller had indeed ignored the abort order. He told them that Miller was reckless and looking for glory. The room went cold. Sarah Miller, sitting in the back row, let out a choked sob. It looked like the end. The board was nodding. Vance had successfully turned one brother in arms against another. But Elias noticed something. Captain Reed's hands were shaking so hard he had to tuck them under the table. He wasn't a villain. He was a hostage. Vance had clearly threatened Reed's career just like he'd tried with Elias. Elias didn't feel anger toward Reed. He felt pity. As the lead colonel prepared to gavel the session to a close and uphold Elias's discharge, Elias stood up. He didn't wait for his turn to speak. "Captain Reed," Elias said, his voice echoing in the small room, "do you remember the day you earned your wings? Do you remember the oath we all took to the Constitution, not to a general and not to a star, but to the truth?" Vance's lawyer jumped up. "Objection! The witness has already testified." "I'm not asking for testimony," Elias said, pulling a small battered digital recorder from his pocket. "I'm asking the captain if he recognizes this radio frequency." Elias pressed play, but it wasn't the Kunar Valley audio. It was a recording from that morning, in the hallway before the hearing. A recording of General Vance telling Captain Reed exactly what would happen to his family's health insurance if he didn't stick to the script. The colonel at the center of the board dropped his pen. Vance's face turned a shade of purple that signaled the end of a dynasty. The silence that followed the recording was heavy. The kind of silence that usually preceded an artillery strike. General Vance didn't try to explain. He didn't try to lie. He simply stood up, his face the color of wet ash, and walked toward the door. But he didn't make it. The lead colonel of the board, a man named Sterling who had seen 3 tours in Iraq, didn't even use his gavel. He just said, "Sit down, Marcus." It was the first time in 20 years anyone had called the general by his first name. It wasn't a sign of friendship. It was the sound of a man being stripped of his status in real time. Within 10 minutes, the JAG officers weren't looking at Elias anymore. They were looking at Vance. The investigation had flipped. The board ordered an immediate freeze on Vance's command and a seizure of his personal server. The predator had become the prey. 3 days later, Elias Thorne didn't drive his truck through the gates of Fort Drum as a civilian. He was summoned back in a military transport. As the vehicle approached the main gate, Elias saw something that made the air catch in his throat. The MPs at the gate, the same ones who had escorted him out with a cardboard box, didn't ask for his ID. They simply snapped to attention and offered a slow, sharp salute. Lining the road all the way to the headquarters building were his men, hundreds of them, not in formation, not because they were ordered to, but because the word had spread. They stood in silence, some in their grease-stained motor pool coveralls, others in full ACUs. As Elias stepped out of the transport, a low, rhythmic sound started, the sound of boots hitting the pavement in unison. It was a hua that shook the New York pines. He wasn't just back, he was home. Elias Thorne didn't go back to the motor pool. General Graham and the Board of Inquiry realized that a man with his level of integrity was too valuable to waste on logistics. He was promoted to Master Sergeant and appointed as the lead ethics liaison for the division, a new role designed to ensure that no Marcus Vance could ever bury the truth again. He moved into an office that overlooked the parade grounds. On his desk sat a single item, the battered digital recorder that had saved the truth. And Marcus Vance, he wasn't just fired. He was stripped of his rank, his pension was forfeited, and he faced a civilian trial for witness tampering and obstruction of justice. The Pentagon Prince ended up in a suit that wasn't navy blue, it was orange. But for Elias, the real victory wasn't the general's fall. It was the letter he received a month later. It was from Sarah Miller. She sent a photo of her son, little Leo, standing in front of his father's memorial. The caption read, "He knows his daddy was a hero now. Thank you for keeping the light on." In a world of short-term gains and political theater, it's easy to think that the truth is a luxury we can't afford. We see men like Vance and think the good guys always finish last. But Elias Thorne reminded us of something sacred. A uniform doesn't make a leader. The truth does. He didn't wear a general's stars, but he upheld the highest rank of all, a man of his word. What happened in that windowless room in the Pentagon wasn't just a legal victory. It was a reminder that honor isn't something you're given. It's something you defend every single day, even when it costs you everything. We want to hear from you today. Have you ever been pressured to stay quiet when you knew something was wrong? Have you ever stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves? Share your story in the comments. Let's build a community where honor still matters. If this story reminded you why we respect our men and women in uniform, please like, subscribe, and share this with a veteran in your life. We tell these stories because they deserve to be told, because sometimes the loudest voice in the room is the one that refuses to lie. Thank you for watching.